Hello. So, in the last video, we discussed CSS very briefly. We talked about some basic elements such as how we can use CSS, the three different methods that I talked about, as well as class and ID selectors and how they differ. And in this video, we're going to talk about CSS in a little more depth and detail, and we're going to discuss some things such as pseudo-classes, fonts, margins and paddings, which is very important. CSS units such as pixels and and rem and percentage. And we're also going to discuss the CSS float property, which can be really important. So if you guys like my videos and the content that I'm creating, please let me know in the comments. If you guys also want some other subjects to be included in my videos, also please tell me in the comments, and I'm going to make sure to review them. And I'm going to try my best to create everything you guys like. So there's that. Also, as a last thing, please make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you. Alright, let's talk about CSS pseudo-classes. So what are pseudo-classes? Pseudo-classes are basically a way for us to select elements, and they use colons. Colons are used to say, for example, what happens so that like CSS selects these elements. Like what is so special about those elements that CSS has to select them. And I'm going to explain this in a little more detail soon. But first we have to set up our project. Let's clean up a little what we did last time. Let's link our style.css file, which is in the style folder. We say link, and then the href is going to be the address of that style, which is going to be styles, and then / style.css, right? So now these two are linked, and now we are going to basically copy paste this one, make a new one of this, and if we save and reload the page, we see that there's two of these, okay? So what we have in mind is that we want, first of all, we want this one to be disappeared. We want this one to basically not be there at all, just to be vanished. So let's disappear it. We're going to go to style.css. Oh, first, let's actually make a selector for this. Let's give it an ID, call it secondary div. Okay, just a generic ID. And then over here, we're just going to say display none. Well, display none, what it does is it just makes it disappear. Okay, so there are multiple values for display, if you can see over here, but display none is going to basically disappear the item. So that's what we're going to use. If you save and reload the page, you see that the second one is hidden. Basically, it's not hidden; it's just basically destroyed, like it doesn't exist. So what we're going to do is we want CSS to basically show us that element, which we just hid right now, whenever we hover our cursor, the mouse cursor on this one, okay? So whenever we move on this, we want that element that we just hid to appear and show up. And whenever we just go away, we want it to just go away again. The way we can do this with CSS is pretty simple. We're going to use a pseudo class, for example. Well, first of all, we have to specify a selector for this one. Give it an ID of, say, main div. Save, and let's copy this ID. Go over here and say main div, and the way we do this, we put a colon after this, and then we say, as you can see, there's so many values for the pseudo class, but the one we're going to use is hover, the hover element. That this is going to tell CSS that whenever you hover on this one, which is before the colon, whenever we hover, something's going to happen. What's going to happen? Something's basically going to happen to this second element, which is hidden right now. So we're going to put that second element over here. We're going to select it using the ID that we specified over here. And then we're going to open up the curly braces. So just to go over this one more time. Well, what we do is we say, if you hover on the main div, which is the first one, then what's going to happen on the secondary div, which is the second one, which is hidden right now, is going to be as follows, which is display block. We're going to change the display none to display block. Let's save. Let's reload the page. And it looks like it's not working. Okay, so I think the reason is that we have to use the plus sign over here. Well, what the plus sign does is it actually just specifies that this one is actually adjacent to this item, to this element, meaning that it comes right after it, and it's like basically within the same parent. Okay, so it's not like there's another div which this is under. It's like they're both in the same div, which is the body div, and if the secondary one comes right after the main div. So we save and reload the page. There you go. As you can see, whenever you hover on this element, the other one is going to pop up. So there are a few other things we can do with pseudo classes. One of them is, for example, selecting the first child of a bunch of elements. Say we have like 100 divs and we want to select the first one, okay? And we don't want to like give that one an ID, okay? So what we can do is we can just say div colon first child, as easy as that, and then curly braces and say background color, I don't know, green. Save and reload, and it's going to make the first one green, and that's not the second one or the third one or the fifth one, only the first one. It's going to select only the first type of this element. We can actually use many other things, such as p, any other tag that you want, and it's going to select only the first child. There is another cool thing we can do with the pseudo classes, and that is, for example, let's say we want only every third div to be, I don't know, with a different background color, okay? Or like every fourth div or every fifth div, you know, or like every fifth div plus one, you know, like you'll see what I'm talking about in a second. Just see div, and we're going to use this time, we're going to use nth child, and then we're going to open up curly braces, and inside here we're going to say 3n, just to basically specify that this is going to be every third element, and 3n is going to do that for us. And then we're going to say background color, let's say, I don't know, one of these colors. Pick something beautiful, aquamarine. We're going to save, and if you reload, obviously we don't have any divs to work with right now. Let's make a new div. Let's copy these two paragraphs inside, and let's make so many of them right now. Paste, paste, paste. Save it, and if you reload, you can see that every third element that we have over here is going to be with that background color. So basically we can just affect every third element. Now if we change this to every second element and reload the page, it's going to be every second element. And so basically we have, if I hover on this, all of them are going to show. There is this one, there is basically this one which is hidden, there is this one and this one. Every second div is going to be changed to the background color of aquamarine. So that's basically what we have with pseudo classes. There are so many of them. In fact, there is a whole list of them over here, and if you can see, I'm just going to scroll all the way down. There's a whole you know, table of whatever you can do with the pseudo classes. There is active, there is focus, first child, which I explained, enabled. The one that I really like is checked. You know, it's basically going to select every checkbox that is already checked, the inputs type checkbox that's already checked, and there's just so many of them, you know, just go nuts with it. Last child, we also have that. And these are really going to help you guys select elements more effectively without actually having to add any classes or IDs to the elements that you're going to select. Right, guys, let's go ahead and talk about fonts. So the way fonts work is that we have 5 generic font families, and every other font family is actually under these families. For example, we have the serif family, we have the sans serif family, we have the monospace family, we have the cursive family, and we have the fantasy family. Well, the last 3 are not generally used as much. You might have heard of serif and sans serif, but monospace, cursive, and fantasy are quite new, and they're not supported by every browser, and it's mostly supported by just new ones. But they're there and they're beautiful. I'm not sure if like all 3 of these are new, but I'm pretty sure like 1 or 2 of them are. So there's that, and let's just discuss the difference between serif and sans serif for now. So as you guys can see, this is what a serif font family looks like, and this is what a sans serif looks like. The difference is pretty obvious, and if we just zoom in a little, just to make it more obvious, if you guys can see, there are these little edges down here, like these, you know, like if you look at T, it's like there's this small edge down here, and that's what basically serif does. It gives them, you know, little edges, little curves, and, you know, makes them basically kind of interesting, you know, if you would like to call it that. But well, sans serif is basically it's considered to be more readable on browsers, and because it doesn't have any curves, it doesn't have any edges at the end, and it's just plain and simple and to the point. And this is what a sans serif family looks like, and this is exactly a serif one, and this is very clear what the difference is, right? Just look at H over here. It's like these two are just basically almost touching. So this is the difference between serif and sans serif. These two are the main font families out there, and all the other fonts are categorized under serif and sans serif or the other three. And just to give you guys a look at how monospace and cursive and fantasy look, this is monospace. It's cool. This is cursive. It is quite cursive, as you can see, and this is the fantasy font. And these are used less commonly than, well, the first two. So these are the font families, and the way we actually go define font families on CSS is that we go use font family followed by the font that we want. So I've used the serif, sans serif, monospace, and cursive and fantasy fonts for each of these guys, but the way that it's basically suggested and recommended that you guys use the font family property at CSS is different. So basically, we don't just go ahead and say font family colon Times New Roman. Okay, say we want to change the font to Times New Roman, which is actually a serif font. We don't do that. We go ahead and say Times New Roman, and then we follow that by basically fallback fonts, which are just backup fonts, meaning that if the browser doesn't support the first font, then it's going to go for the second font. If there is a third font, then it's going to go for the third font. If the third font also is not supported, it's going to go look for the fourth one. If the fourth one is not supported, it's going to keep going on and on. But therefore, it's basically recommended that you guys put 3, 4, 5, different fonts, so that the last one, and the last one is supposed to be the generic font family, because the generic font families are supported by, say, 99% of the browsers out there, and you're not going to have any problem with that. And some font is going to be displayed at least, because if I only put Times New Roman here and Times New Roman is not supported by this browser, then the browser is just going to use its own default font, and your font is not going to be shown at all. So this is how we use the font family. The next thing that I'm going to show you guys is how we can say, change the font size. And the way we do that is choose the font size property and say, well, we can use large, larger, medium, small, smaller, X large, and all these, but we can also use pixels. So for now, let's just use large, reload, and it's going to be large, it's going to be larger, reload, it's going to be a little larger, X large. I never used this one myself. It's going to be X large, X I believe was also there. This is like really large, but people don't really go for these because they're not exactly going to work perfectly when it comes to different browser, different sizes, mobile phones. It's going to really mess things up. So the way we do that is actually pixels are not that great either, but we're going to get to that later. So we can, for example, use pixels. Let's say 32 pixels. We save, we reload. It is exactly 32 pixels. Let's say 48 pixels. The reload is going to get bigger, and you can use as many pixels as you want. That is 10,000 pixels, and it is very huge. Everything got lost. I think 1,000 pixels can be dealt with. Yeah, it's really big, right? Pretty huge. So yeah, you can basically use pixels. You can also use percentage, which is going to use the basically what your div has. If your div basically has a font of whatever, then it's going to be using that exactly, like 100% of that. And by default, every div on a web page has a font size of 16 pixels or 1em, which we're going to talk about later. But if this is 16 pixels, 100% of it is going to be 16 pixels. If we put 50%, it's going to be 8 pixels, and 8 pixels is pretty small. So but like, let's say you define the font for this div to be like 32 pixels, then the 50% is not going to be 8 pixels anymore. It's going to be 16 pixels. So let's just, for example, say div first child, which we discussed earlier, font size 32 pixels. Okay. So we just changed the font size of this guy, this div, to be 32 pixels. So 50% of 32 pixels is going to be 16 pixels now. And if we reload the page, this is going to be 16 pixels. Okay, if we make it to say 64 pixels, and if we reload, it's going to get even bigger. Okay, meaning that this guy is going to be bigger. What if we not make it 50%? I think it's going to be still 100%, and it's going to get even bigger. See? By default, everything is at the 100% of the div, but when you make it less, then it's going to be less. If you make it double, I believe we can also use 200%. It is possible. Why not? There you go. So this is basically, we call these relative, basically units, which is basically relative to the parent, right? So this is one way of doing it too. There are also units such as M and rem. Let's comment this out, which we're going to talk about later. But for now, just know that this property is used like this. The font size property is used like that. Well, the other thing that we can talk about is the font weight. Let's say you want to make this bold, and the way you do that is just go ahead and say font weight bold. Reload. It's going to get bold. Let's say you want to make it like real bold. You are going to have to give it some number. Say 100. It's not really much. 1,000. That's good. 10,000. Okay, apparently it's not even supported. There are some units that are suggested here. Font weight. Let's try 900. Really not that bold. But bolder. I'm actually not sure how bold this can get. Apparently this can't really get any bolder than this. But let's try this on some other font. Let's say sans serif. If we reload this, it's going to be like that. If we give it 1,000, it's going to be like bolder. Yeah, so apparently serif font cannot be bolder than that, like the Times New Roman font which is used here. And well, the sans serif one can get pretty bold. So, just trying things out. So this is how you can make it bold. You can just use a number between, I think, 100 and 1,000. I think it can go on and on, like even bigger, but no, I think, yeah, there's a stop to it. I think 1,000 is the max. You guys can check this out, but font weight property is used to make it bolder. There's another thing, let's say you want to style it, make it italic. You're going to use the font style property, make it italic. Reload, and there you go. That's how you make it italic. Alright guys, let's talk about margins and paddings and how they're different. So, in order to show you guys what margins and paddings are, so we're gonna make this one a little smaller to demonstrate how it's gonna look with 50%. So we're gonna say the first div is going to have a width of 50% compared to its parent. And if we reload it over here, we can see that it's actually cut in half. So what a margin is basically the space you put around an element, to the outside of an element, okay? So if we say, for example, margin property, and we set it to 10 pixels, and save and reload over here, we can see that there is a 10 pixel space between this element and everything else around it, okay? Now, if we want to actually make it more visible for you guys, let's give one of these guys in between an ID. Let's call this ID of middle div, and we're going to give this middle div a margin. Let's say middle div margin 20 pixels. So we're going to give the middle div a margin of 20 pixels, and yeah, this is much more clearly explaining how it looks. And yeah, it's just basically giving it a 20 pixel difference from all the sides. We can make this like just, for the top or the bottom or the left or the right. We can say margin top, for example, only equal to 20 pixels. It's going to make the top part a little, basically spaced. We can make it margin bottom. Same thing. It's going to be at the bottom. Left and right also are possible. Left, and that is right. And yeah, that's basically how margin works. It's pretty simple. Just space to the outside of the element. And there is another thing called a padding. Padding is basically that same space, but it's inside the element. So we're just saying the space between the borders of the element and the content that's inside of it. So what we do is that we can just go ahead and say clean. Yeah, let's clear this up. And say padding 10 pixels. And what actually happens is that it puts a space between the content that's inside of this div and the borders, and it's going to make it look a little neater. It's much better to actually have a padding than not have one. So if you say, let's delete this and reload, you can see that this basically paragraph and also this heading, they're really stuck to the left side of this element, and it doesn't look cool, right? So in order to kind of give it some sort of indentation, we do this. So what we can do, just to make it even more beautiful, and they actually do it every day, is that we give the whole thing some sort of padding, and we also give this paragraph a little more padding to make it a little indented, right? To basically give it some space so that it looks like it's the child of this heading. And you can see middle div P. It's basically saying that the P that's inside of the middle div, select that and give this one a padding of, instead of 10 pixels, let's make it 15 pixels to just to override the overall padding. And as you guys can see, this has more of a padding, and it's more like it's like a child of this header. And basically, we call this indentation. It's indented from the left side. And that's basically what padding is. Padding is for the inside, and margin is for the outside. Right, guys, let's discuss CSS units. And well, CSS units can be divided into two categories. The first one is absolute units, and the second one is relative units. Absolute units, we've been working with them for a while, and they are well, very rigid. They don't change on different screens. For example, if you select the width to be, instead of like 50%, let's call it like 200 pixels, and save and reload. This is going to be 200 pixels on every device, on every screen, and it's not going to change. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because it might look really small on some devices and it might look really big on some devices. Let's say I have a screen which is which has like a resolution of 3,000 pixels on on the width. So well, 200 pixels is going to look really small compared to like the maximum 3,000 pixel width, and that's not a good thing, right? So what we do is we usually go for well, relative units, and that is exactly why I'm going to stop talking about absolute units for now, and we're not going to use them at all. We're going to try to use them as little as possible, unless we know exactly what the user's monitor or screen is going to be like, and that's probably never the case. So we are going to stop using absolute ones, and we're going to go for relative units, which are basically relative to the parent div, to the parent container. And in our case, the parent container is going to be the body tag. And what we can do is, instead of saying 200 pixels, we can just go ahead and use 50% of it. 50% is going to be taking up 50% of the width of the parent, which is in our case the body, and has all the width over here. So 50% of it is going to be this much. And no matter how big or small the user's screen is, it's always going to be 50%, okay? And that is much better, right? But let me just give you guys a little, well, heads up too. It's not necessarily a good thing when the user is using a phone which has a very small width and a very big height, right? Because 50% of that small width is going to be really small, and maybe all of our content is not going to fit in that, okay? And in that case, there's something else called media query, which I'm going to explain in the next video. That's going to help you guys make it maybe full size, like make it 100% when the user's screen is very small, okay? So you're going to need stuff like that, tools like that, which are going to help you make more of a responsive design. And by responsive, I mean a design which is going to work fantastically on a phone, on a tablet, and on a monitor, on a big monitor. So these and responsive designs are the necessary designs these days, and every design you make, it has to be responsive, okay? Because we're making for everyone, and a lot of people, I would say over 50% of people, are currently using phones to browse the web, and we wouldn't want everybody to be forced to use the web with their computer. So there's that. All right, so yeah, that is the percent. I already explained this one. The next thing I can explain to you guys is VW and VH. If we change percent to VW and save and reload, you guys can probably not see much of a difference, and that is because VW means view width, meaning that, okay, so this is our view, right? This is our viewport currently, and it's basically the size of the browser, okay? And 50 VW means 50% of the view width of whatever the browser width is. Make 50% of it and give it the width of 50% of whatever the viewport is. So currently it is like this, and if I like increase the size of this, that's going to increase with it as well, and it's going to always take up 50% of the view width. And this is cool because no matter how much margin or padding you give this one to this div, it's always going to take up half the view's width. If you give it 100 VW, it's going to take up all the screen no matter how much margin or padding you give it. Okay, and now it already has taken all of it, but you see, as you can see, we already have a little margin. It's going to look a little weird, and it's going to have a little overflow. It's going to get out of the screen, and it's always going to get out of the screen. It's not like if you make it smaller or like bigger, it's going to fit in the screen somehow. No, it's always going to be 100% of the view width. We have basically the same thing for view height as well. If you want to give it a good height, let's go ahead and say height is equal to 80 VH. And yeah, as you guys can see, W is for width, H is for height. And save and reload is going to take up 80% of the view height. And if you make it 100, and it's going to take all the view height. And this is pretty cool for when you want to make like a little container that's going to take up all the user's screen. You must have seen these on, for example, car websites. When a new car is out, they make it like there's a whole big div which has the car, and no matter what browser you use, it's going to take up the whole, width and height of the browser just for the first time you open it up, and then when you scroll down small, like slowly, it just basically overflows out of the screen, and it's a pretty cool and useful thing, VW and VH, and it's really responsive. So this is really recommended to be used, and this is it. So mostly what we use for divs and basically width and height is either percent is used a lot, or VW and VH. And what are we going to do about the font size? Well, we're going to use M and REM instead of using pixels for font sizes. And we are going to, yeah, like we've used over here. And I'm going to explain to you guys in just a second what M means. So each M is equal to the font size that is already set for the parent of that element, okay? So the font size of that element is by default set to be 16 pixels on most of the browsers. Okay, so each basically div that we create on the web, it has a base font size of 16 pixels. So if you say 1M, it's going to be 16 pixels. If you say 2M, it's going to be double that, which is 32 pixels. Okay, and if 3M, 48 pixels. Same very simple. But you can actually change this by making basically the base font, instead of making it 16 pixels, which is the default, you can make it 32 pixels. And then 1M is going to mean a lot more. 1M is going to be 32 pixels, okay? And this is pretty cool because when the user is going to use a mobile phone for your website, it's going to automatically adjust, and because the browsers have different default fonts on basically smaller browsers, on smaller devices, so it's going to automatically adjust and make it look pretty cool. So that's what we use, M, or we can actually use something else called rem as well. If I put rem over here, it's not going to make any difference because rem is exactly the same as M, except the difference is that M is talking about the parent's font size, like, well, the parent of these two is this div, which is orange now, but rem is talking about the HTML tags font size. So just to give you guys a little example of how this is going to look, HTML font size is equal to 16 pixels. This is the default, okay? It's always 16 pixels by default, so if I reload this, nothing's going to happen. But since we're using rem, it's going to be equal to exactly what we say over here because it's the root's font size. And if we change this to 160 pixels and reload, everything's going to get bigger. Why? Because we're talking about the R and REM, and REM is the root's our HTML tags font size. So if we change that, that's going to change accordingly. And if we change it to something smaller, 8 pixels, and save and reload, there you go. It's going to look really small. Okay. So yeah, and that's all there is about CSS units. Right, guys, that's it. So I know it was a lot to handle, but now you know so much more about CSS and you can do so many cool, stylish things with it. But we're not done yet. In the next video, we're going to talk even more and deeper about CSS, and we're going to talk about things such as CSS positioning, flexbox, and animations, as well as transitions. So till next time, bye!